Good morning and welcome to the Phoenix Center Annual Telecom Symposium Economist panel. This panel is a standard feature of the annual Telecom Symposium. It provides an opportunity for economists to present economic ideas that are helpful for framing current policy debates and for analyzing the economic aspects of current telecom policy issues. At least that's what we aspire to do, and I think more often than not we succeed in doing that. Our economics panel today includes the following well-known and well-regarded economists in the Washington telecoms policy community. Since they are well-known, I will be very brief in their introduction, and you can certainly turn to the websites of their employers to get all the bio detail that you would like. I will introduce them in the order of their presentation. Our first speaker will be Hal Singer, who is currently Managing Director and Principal at Navigant Economics. He's also an affiliate at the International Center for Law and Economics and has served as an adjunct professor at the School of Business at Georgetown University. He's written numerous articles on competition policy and antitrust issues and has provided expert testimony in various regulatory and court cases. Our second speaker will be Tim Brennan, sitting on the far end, who is currently Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the Department of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He's also a senior fellow with Resources for the Future. Prior to his current academic appointment, Tim was an economist with the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice and has also served as senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. He has also written numerous articles on antitrust issues in various academic journals. Our third speaker is George Ford, who is chief economist here at the Phoenix Center. He's also adjunct professor of economics at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. His telecom industry experience includes serving as chief economist at ZTEL Communications in Tampa, Florida, and serving as senior economist in the Office of Policy and Strategic Planning at MCI WorldCom Corporation. Prior to his industry experience, George was also an economist in the Competition Division, part of the Office of General Counsel at the Federal Communications Commission. He has authored or co-authored many policy papers for the Phoenix Center, published numerous articles in academic journals. That is our panel this morning. Let me note finally, before having Hal begin, that the views expressed by the panelists and the moderator today reflect only personal views of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers, their institutional sponsors, or the U.S. government or other entities. And with that, Hal?
Well, I want to thank quickly Larry and George for having me today. It should become apparent very quickly that I did not spend my New Year's Eve preparing these remarks. Instead, when I was not ingesting telephone calls, no, pork 3 ways from my... That's all right. This is good stuff. When I was not ingesting pork 3 ways from my Latino in-laws or soaking my Bikram yoga mat without a hose. You missed the pork joke. I was trying to digest 3 new books over the break. The first is Nate Silver's book on our inability to predict, Susan Crawford's book on our inability to serve broadband to the masses at affordable rates, and R.A. Dickey's book on our inability to trust the knuckleball. I highly recommend all 3 of these, but after you read these 3 about our collective failure, I suggest you purchase the future New York Times bestseller titled The Need for Speed by Bob Lighton and yours truly, which will be released in the coming weeks by Brookings. Well, it takes Ms. Crawford 270 pages to explain her view of broadband policy. Bob and I make our case in less than 100 pages. And unlike Ms. Crawford, we offer an empirically supported diagnosis of broadband competition, and we offer sound policy that is grounded in that empirical reality. Now, if Ms. Crawford's diagnosis were correct, namely that the provision of wireline broadband was a natural monopoly that was safely secured by cable providers, and that wireline broadband was a complement, did not compete with wireless broadband, then her prescription for rate-regulated, government-sanctioned cable monopolies would be a logical starting point. Alas, some pesky facts get in her way. Let's start with the stale concept of natural monopolies. The concept is so anathema to the 21st century economy that I had to crack open Baumel's seminal article from 1977 on the topic, which roughly coincided with President Carter's and Ted Kennedy's recognition that the airlines were not a natural monopoly. Now, you know you're out there when you get to the left of those liberal lions. Natural monopoly is a condition about the cost technology of an industry, whereby it is most efficient to concentrate all supply in the hands of a single firm. One implication of a natural monopoly is that the largest provider in the industry has an overwhelming cost advantage, and that cost advantage actually discourages entry by its rivals. I think we can all agree that cable is the largest provider of wireline broadband by number of subscriptions. But does cable have an overwhelming cost advantage over its rivals such that it can discourage entry? Well, try telling that to Verizon or AT&T or the rural telcos who've been laying fiber furiously over the past decade. Now, while it is true that cable plant currently covers more homes than telco-provided fiber, that gap is manageable, and more important, it is shrinking. Our book takes you through the gory details, but this is what you need to know. According to the FCC's most recent data, which reflects broadband deployment as of June 2011, 55% of U.S. households were beholden to a single provider of wireline broadband capable of delivering speeds at 6 megabits per second down. Now, that's the headline grabber. But look one column to the left and you'll see that only 14% of U.S. households were beholden to a single wireline broadband provider capable of achieving speeds of 3 megabits per second down. Now, according to the FCC's latest definition of broadband, something magical happens to the user's experience when he crosses that 4 megabit per second threshold. Now, ideally, the policy folks at the FCC, like Blair, who's going to be speaking soon, could coordinate with the analysts at the Wireline Competition Bureau to give us the competitive breakdown at that magical 4 megabit per second rate. But instead, we get to see competition at the 3 megabits per second rate and the 6 megabit per second rate. However, if you can accept that there is no meaningful difference to a consumer's experience between 3 megabits per second and 4 megabits per second, then the notion of natural monopoly evaporates, as a full 86% of U.S. households had a choice of 2 or more wireline broadband providers as of June 2011. Now, with respect to cable's alleged cost advantage, I suggest reading yesterday's Wall Street Journal, which explained that given the shared network architecture of the cable plant, to offer faster speeds, cable providers would have to invest billions of additional dollars, an amount that even the cable executives said could not be justified. So much for any going forward cost advantage. Now, cable companies that own must-have programming, of course, can make life difficult for the telcos, but those costs are constrained, at least in theory, by the program access rules. Of course, the June 2011 numbers from the Wireline Competition Bureau do not reflect broadband deployment between June 2011 and December 2012, nor do they reflect the additional 32 million customer locations that will be covered by some variant of AT&T's UVerse over the next 3 years, which will further shrink the coverage gap. But even accepting this 6 megabit per second threshold, the 55% headline grabber that I quoted earlier does not include wireless broadband connections. Now, to sweep these connections under the rug Ms. Crawford and her ilk must claim that wireless broadband is a complement to wireline connections. Now try telling that to the median household that earns $57,000 per year and must decide which of two connection options they can squeeze into their budget. Wireless connections might be complements for high-earning law professors and consulting economists, but getting 2 doses of high-speed internet would be a luxury for many. Moreover, wireless speeds are approaching cable modem speeds, which indicate that 4G is a reasonable substitute to cable connections. A June 2012 speed test by PC Magazine showed that the average 4G LTE speeds, download speeds, were 15 megabits per second. By comparison, average cable download speeds by Comcast and Cox were 17 megabits per second. Sounds the same to me, unless, of course, something magical happens between 15 megabits per second and 17 megabits per second down. Cisco, which should know a thing or two about broadband technology, recently estimated that up to 15% of U.S. customers could cut their broadband wireline cord in favor of a mobile data connection by 2016. And if these speed comparisons and Cisco's word don't persuade you, then consider the following survey data about actual consumer choices. According to a June 2012 Pew Internet survey, 17% of cell phone owners do most of their online browsing on their phone rather than on a desktop computer. But why let these little facts get in the way of good advocacy? If cable broadband is not a natural monopoly, and if wireless broadband is a substitute for wireline, then we are left with only 2 policy options after we toss Ms. Crawford's plea for state-sanctioned government monopolies into the regulatory dustbin. Either we do nothing, or, as advocated by Christopher Yu in his new book titled The Dynamic Internet, quote, create a regulatory enforcement regime that evaluates any charges of improper behavior on a case-by-case basis after the fact. Although we take a different route, Bob Light and I arrive at the same place. We go a step further by explaining that the FCC already has a case-by-case process in place for adjudicating discrimination complaints in the cable video space. Now, assuming Congress gives the FCC authority to adjudicate similar complaints in the internet space, not just against internet access providers, but also against search engines, we think case-by-case adjudication by an administrative law judge overseen by the FCC is the best way forward. Rather than asking agencies for taxpayer-funded investigations, a complaining website should incur the litigation cost associated with hiring expensive lawyers and testifying economists, which would discourage frivolous cases. Gone would be the days of 300-page internet orders that ban entire classes of conduct, and gone would be the days that the Federal Trade Commission has to threaten unorthodox application of the antitrust laws to curb discrimination on the internet. If we as a society think that independent content providers are overmatched by the likes of vertically integrated firms like Comcast and Google, then let's give those websites an explicit path for protection and then get out of the way. To conclude, in a world with at least 4 distinct broadband technologies reaching into our homes, cable, fiber, wireless, and now satellite, the majority of future disputes in the telecom space will be vertical in nature. Content providers will demand non-discriminatory access to customers, and broadband providers will demand non-discriminatory access to affiliated content. To accommodate those discrimination complaints, the FCC needs a new vertical framework that is based on the rule of reason analysis and a case-by-case review. And it needs to get out of the way of horizontal merger business, which is best left to the antitrust agencies. In an age of 4-way intramodal competition, the last thing we need is a government-sanctioned broadband monopoly. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Sorry for Hal having to give his talk in front of that. First, I have to start off by saying that before I got here today, I didn't realize that George, Jerry, and Larry were all guitar junkies. I think between the four of us, we probably have 70 guitars at a rough estimate. People who aren't guitar players probably have no idea how true Larry's musician joke is. I've got 20, and I was just telling George about how I had my eye on another one. I'm going to sort of rush through what I've been, for a variety of reasons, I've just been thinking about what should the FCC be doing. There's even some argument out there, why should we even have one? And so I'm just going to rush through a bunch of these things. If anyone has any reactions to this, I know that we're sort of time constrained in a variety of ways, please send me an email at brennan@umbc.edu. I don't have a Facebook page to post it on. Not only do I not have a Facebook page, I'm one of those people, I guess maybe it's a function of age, who can't understand why anyone has a Facebook page. But anyhow, be that as it may, so this is sort of what I want to talk about today, is that this sort of question, what makes telecom special? You know, Hal actually sort of set up some of this with some of his comments, especially toward the end. And so I want to talk about whether, you know, whether that's correct, where it's correct, where it might not be correct, and just sort of throw some ideas out there. Now, so what sort of things might an agency be doing? And one would be mitigating market power by promoting competition. And I think the redundancy argument, or the leave it to the Antitrust Authority's point that Hal just made, I think applies most strongly here. What makes telecom different? You've got competition authorities out there. The specialized knowledge argument isn't too compelling to someone who was at the Antitrust Division when he broke up the phone company. They could figure that out. And arguably, well, it's an old argument, but whether they did a better job than the FCC did about handling that sort of thing is another question. However, this is the one place where I will bring up legal stuff, is that if you want that to happen, you've got to get the law changed. Because there are a series of decisions, not just Trinco, that essentially have told the antitrust authorities, they've said the antitrust laws don't apply when there's a government overseer someplace else. And that's true despite explicit savings clauses. There's one in the 96 Telecom Act. There's one of these in Flamingo involves the Postal Service. The merits of that particular case are really screwy. But what the court said there is, despite an explicit that the USPS could sue or be sued when it was created, they said, well, except for antitrust. If you agree with Hal that you think that the Antitrust Authority should be handling this stuff, there's some real legal work to do, or statutory work to do. It's not just going to happen automatically given Supreme Court decisions that are out there. Okay, next, price regulation. That's something that the antitrust authorities can't do. By and large, there are a few kind of exceptions and sort of consent decree-like things, but those things don't apply to natural monopoly regulation. But as sort of as Hal pointed out, there's a factual question, obviously. Are there any? Now, I don't agree that technological change in and of itself precludes them. It can create them. That's not, there's nothing, I think it's more neutral than that. But that said, there's a question about, well, do we have natural monopolies out there in various things? Some people have talked about mobile backhaul. I don't know enough about that. I think the fact that we've got two wire lines running to a lot of homes, as Hal pointed out, is essentially a historical accident. And whether those facilities are both going to be maintained in such a way that we're going to have that remains to be seen. But as you pointed out, well, but maybe mobile is going to be out there and so on. So whether there's a case for having the FCC around for that is kind of limited. And also whether what they would do would be essentially to restrict competition by essentially emphasizing non-discrimination as opposed to worrying about price levels is another regulatory issue. Okay. Next is on market power. There's a network externality issue. And this goes back, I think the 96 Act recognized this, which is that there's two sources of market power out there potentially. One's these physical economies of scale, the cost issues that Hal talked about. But there's also the idea that everyone wants to be on the same system. and a lot of the standards issues that take place out there, in some sense, take care of that without us thinking about it. You know, that internet protocols are just sort of out there for the taking, for example. And one of the things that's also there is just the ability that everyone has to interconnect with everybody else to communicate. More broadly, So one needs to, one may need some sort of regulator out there to deal with that. And I say that partly because I kind of mistrust, from my antitrust background, the idea of saying, well, if we're going to have interconnection, let's get all the competitors in the room and let them set mutual interconnection rates. And one could imagine them doing so and setting high prices, essentially price fixing through that. So the idea of having some regulator out there essentially setting those rates and policies, and perhaps setting the rates at 0 through bill and keep or something like that, may be a useful function for an FCC. Next is, is universal service. Now, this is on the network externality side. I'll talk about another rationale for this perhaps toward the end. One, of course, rationale for universal service was that the value of the phone to me depended upon how many other people used it. The fact I actually talk about telephones probably indicates how old I am. And this is some sense manifested in these interconnection regulations and so on. And I've wondered at Phoenix Center things before, things about whether this is really the best rationale for something like network neutrality, not network neutrality, but maybe something like a minimum quality standard, where the idea is that in some sense the value of internet access to me depends upon my confidence that you can access links I put on my website. Whether that justifies, whether the benefits exceed the cost of a less intrusive regulatory resolution of this is a very good question to which I don't have the answer. But I think it's a much sounder argument than market power, especially if you could leave the market power question to antitrust authorities, which of course you can't unless someone gets Trinko out of the way. All right, consumer protection. Well, what's this all about? One idea is that, well, maybe, it's hard for consumers to search for things, so maybe the government can do it for them. I'm actually not averse to that argument on a cost-benefit test standard, although I suspect that it's not true here. That it could be efficient if the cost of the error exceed or less than the cost of the search. I doubt that that's the case here. Is there an asymmetric information problem? I don't know whether there is or there isn't, but maybe some sort of quality certification role could be of some use here. I'm not an expert in that. And then finally, there's this, well, consumers make mistakes. I spend, as was mentioned in the introduction, I spend a lot of time at Resource for the Future. I do a lot of energy work. And energy economists and policy people believe that people make mistakes routinely. That's why we have a law preventing people from buying incandescent light bulbs, because they can't figure out how much better off they'd be with a fluorescent light bulb. Now, you may think, I'd be better off with the other one, but, energy policy people think that you must be making a mistake, and so we're going to make you better off by keeping you from doing that. If you think that these sorts of things are policy justifications, well, the FTC's got a Bureau of Consumer Protection, so maybe that's something that could be punted. Coming up toward the end, wealth distribution. Now, unlike perhaps some people, I'm actually interested in wealth distribution as a policy as a policy criterion, apart from market power issues and so on. And one might think of things like, well, maybe there's a case for redistributive subsidies of some sort in here. I don't really take this argument very seriously for FCC policy, mostly because, I just don't think there's that much money at stake. I mean, you're not flipping people on one side of the poverty line or not, depending upon whether or not you subsidize their broadband bill. If you really are concerned about that, not that we're ever going to do this, but have improve the tax code and that sort of stuff, that kind of thing. We've got all kinds of things. If you're really worried about that, antitrust policy, competition policy, communications policy is probably not a good way to go. Something that's actually more interesting to me is our ethics-based rights arguments, not necessarily legal-based rights arguments involving things like speech and access. this is apart from economic efficiency and apart from equality issues. Is there some reason that, some justification by virtue of personhood, citizenship, things like that, people should have access to or avail, to some sort of service, that may have been a rationale for making sure everybody had a telephone. That could be a rationale for making sure everyone's got broadband. I don't have the knowledge to know whether or not that's sort of justified. But that is an issue that is out there, and maybe how an FCC would go about thinking about that explicitly, apart from market power issues. Is I'm not sure how it would or could do that, but that I think there's an interesting potential policy issue there about whether there is a rights-based argument for this, in the same way one might argue for people having rights to education or rights to be able to vote or that sort of thing. Last and not least, let's finish up here with spectrum allocation, and do we need an FCC for that? Tom Hazlett's argued that once upon a time common law courts could have done it. I'm going to defer that. I think everybody here has got probably more legal expertise on this to assess that argument than I do. There can be market power issues that come up with this, particularly at the antitrust authorities. Many, many years ago now, I was at the antitrust division. One of the jobs that I had was to work with people to decide whether, when the government awarded winners of auctions for drilling rights on particular tracks, whether that would have an anti-competitive effect like a merger would. So one could, have a competitive assessment of these sort of things, at least in principle. Designing auctions, how one does that, well, that depends a lot on whether or not people trust secondary markets to rationalize things, or whether the FCC has to do it up front through its auction design, whether you're concerned about whether the government gets the money or whether the firms are get to keep it one way or the other, how one deals with implicit property rights, having to design incentive auctions to compensate broadcasters for something they don't really own, but politics being what it is, you have to do that. And a concern that people have raised, which is if you look at these things as fundraising vehicles, does that mean that creates an incentive to reduce the supply to drive the price up? And finally, a last thing is, do we need an FCC to serve, along these lines, serve the FCC basically as a zoning commission? Decide how certain sorts of spectrum should get used. I actually still think that's kind of valuable. I think it's nice when people design things like smartphones, they know what frequencies to have them operate on, so they know, and the people are going to be sending out content and so on, know that sort of thing. But I'm not an engineer, and if various kinds of shared spectrum technology or something means that we don't need somebody to do that, so much the better. So anyhow, so I'll just leave those ideas out there, and if anyone's got any comments, maybe we'll have time for questions. If not, please feel free to send me an email, but don't look for a Facebook page. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tim. I always kind of liked your idea on network neutrality. Yeah. Didn't have any legs, apparently, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless. I felt gypped a little bit, only getting about 15 minutes on that. We could have talked for hours, I think, on almost any one of those slides. I'm going to simplify the discussion a little bit in a simple example. But before I do, most of the Phoenix Center stuff, if you look at it, there's always usually, even though the paper may be 50 pages long, some simple neoclassical truth buried in it somewhere that the entire frame is the structure is created around the frame. And one of the things that keeps popping up, and I've seen this 1,000 times lately, not only in the U.S. but internationally, and we heard it this morning from Marcia, is the notion of investment and certainty. And we've got actually two papers that address that question. The Broadband Credibility Gap paper has a model in it, and then we took essentially that model and wrote a shorter perspective on it, which was released just this year, towards the end of this year. And I think there's a blog post on it as well. And to say that what we need is certainty, or that uncertainty reduces investment is not accurate, completely accurate. Okay? The question is, what are you more or less certain about? When we say the effect of investment or uncertainty on investment, normally the way the economists think about that is a spread in the distribution of returns, or the variability in the distribution of returns. Okay, if I know I'm going to get 100%, I'm going to get 15%, that's one thing. Or is it, 8% to 12% with a mean of 10? Or is it 4% to 16% with a mean of 10? Okay, that's usually how it works. And the uncertainty, the greater the spread, then the less inclined you are to invest. The issue with regulation is it actually is a mean shifting event. Instead of it being 10% with a narrow spread or 10% with a very wide spread, it's going from 10% to 8% or 10% to 12%. It's mean shifting, which is a very different model. So the question is not whether I'm more or less certain about the regulatory structure. If you want more investment, then I need to be more certain that returns are going to be favorable. So I need a mean shift in the positive direction. That's what stimulates investment. Okay, so when we say those things, just keep in mind, in the back of your mind, that it's not a matter of certainty and uncertainty. It's what are you certain about? And I thought that Nellie Kroes from Europe made that pretty clear in her recent statements, where they are moving away from what she believes, or the Commission believes, European Commission believes to be regulations that reduce the average respected returns of people that invest in internet facilities. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, although I just did. I have a different topic. And that topic is starts with a very simple setup. And we're going to go through a few points here in economics in a very simple way. There's a lot here, I think, that may be helpful for you. I have probably 3 or 4 economic concepts that I have in my head that just drive pretty much everything that I think about telecom, because there aren't that many underlying economic concepts. There's some fringe stuff, but there's some central core issues with respect to regulation in telecom. Let's take a simple setup and assume there's a seller. It costs $2 to make a product. And you have 2 buyers, buyer A and buyer B. And buyer A is willing to pay $3 for that product, and buyer B is willing to pay $5 for the product. Now, I had an earlier example that had 5 buyers, and it was certainly more interesting. You could bring up other points, but I simplified a little bit here. And let's assume that each customer only wants 1 unit, a broadband connection or something like that. Okay, and we can start asking the question, how do we, what prices, what are the outcomes of society here, if we view this as being the total of society? We can start with the price of $2, which is equal to cost. Both of these guys will buy at $2. The firm makes 0 profit because it costs $2. Consumers get $4 of consumer surplus. This guy's going to get $1, which is what he's willing to pay less what he pays. And this guy gets $3, which is $5 less the $2 he pays. And total surplus of society is $4. Okay, you with me on the math so far? This is principles of economics, but yet can be quite powerful when you think about it. And we can go on. Now, that's one approach, but the seller here wants to maximize his profits, okay? We always assume that. That's an assumption of the U.S. economy. And what I've seen a lot of lately is a criticism of that objective of profit maximization. For an economist, we love the assumption because everything we do kind of comes from it for the most part. If people aren't maximizing profits, then what are they maximizing? I don't know. It's kind of scary to think. If everybody's maximizing something different, there is no mathematics of outcomes anymore because we don't know what the objective function is that everybody's behaving on. It's just a bunch of irrational people. So the profit maximization assumption is quite nice. The great thing about economics is that under certain conditions, we want people to act that way because that's a great way to organize society, and if everybody's doing it at the same time, the results can be pretty favorable. But if we look, if we go through all the potential prices, we end up and we say, okay, at a price of 3, we got a profit of 2. At 4, we get a profit of 2. But at a price of 5, I get a profit of 3. Okay, and I only sell 1 unit because this guy doesn't want it at a price of 5. Buyer A doesn't want it at a price of 5, but I get a profit of 3. And so the seller says, okay, I'm going to set the price at 5, and I'm going to offer this product. I'm going to sell 1 unit of it. But I only end up with 3 units of total surplus. So the total value of this exchange has been cheapened by the fact that this monopoly seller is raising price and has reduced quantity from 2 units to 1 unit. This is the basis for regulation. Now, normally what we do is we look at it in terms, I think I have a slide here of this, which you've probably seen a few thousand times, which assumes there's lots and lots of customers with continuous willingness to pay preferences. The competitive price is PC and output is QC. The monopoly price is PM with an output of QM. So the monopolist raises price, reduces quantity, which creates a deadweight loss. And this is what we're after when we regulate. It's not the transfer of surplus to profit so much. It's the loss of welfare. It's the reduction in quantity in this continuous quantity, variable quantity framework that we're kind of stuck with in our minds when we think about regulation of telecom. But that is the goal here, is to increase total surplus. In this case, if I regulate to a price of 2 at cost-based pricing, I maximize total surplus at 4. Now note that I've left these off here because of the integer nature of this problem. It can be confusing. But the general idea of regulation is to cut price to increase total surplus. And that's the deal. That's what economists will tell you, at least some of them. And here's a little quote I found from the OMB, actually from an FCC order, footnote in FCC order, is that regulation should improve social welfare, which is the total surplus in a partial sense. It can get more complicated if you want to start thinking about other markets that are related and those sorts of things. Those estimates or predictions of how it affects other markets can be pretty weak, in my opinion. Let's say we go to another trick, and this is in economics, another option. Instead of charging a single price to buyer A and buyer B, we let the firm sell at a unique price to each. Okay? In this case, the seller will say, well, I can maximize profits by selling to this guy at 3 and this guy at 5. Now my profits are 4 instead of 3. I've increased my profits. Total surplus has risen to 4, and now I got the same surplus as if I had competition or cost-based prices. So that a differential buyer-specific pricing option can produce the same level of economic total surplus as competition or cost-based pricing. Okay, that's a radical concept to a lot of people, even those who had principles of economics, even though this will be taught to you in principles of economics, I suppose. It's called perfect first-degree price discrimination. Okay, it's kind of hard to implement, which is one issue. But the point here, I think, is interesting, and here's a rule always to write down when you think about problems. The problem with monopoly is not monopoly so much. The problem with monopoly is a uniform price in terms of surplus maximization in a partial equilibrium sense, which means we're talking about this market and not other markets that may be impacted. It's just an interesting little rule. Of course, buyer-specific pricing requires that customers be identified and sorted into groups. I can't sell it to A for $3 and then let A sell it to B for 4, right? I have to separate them. I have to have cheaper meals before 5:30, the cheaper movie before noon, or whatever it is. I have to segment people. You got to show me your ID to prove you're over 60 to get a 10% discount on your meal, or whatever it is. I've got to separate you. If you want to put that in another way, is that buyers must be delineated into unique markets, where I can buy and sell you something and it doesn't get resold someplace else. Now this takes us to an interesting argument that we have seen recently in telecom. What you end up with, if we can think of the market as being buyer specific, you have buyer A and buyer B, and the seller just interacts with the two independently. There's no, relationship between the two markets by assumption. The maximum price for this guy would be 3, the minimum price is 2, and these guys just enter into some bargain. They sit at the table and say, okay, how are we going to work this out? Under some conditions, you get the symmetric Nash equilibrium of 250, which means we'll split the difference between our two willingnesses. And then if you came, the total surplus would be $1. And then down here, you see that we have a minimum price of 2, which is cost, a maximum price of 5, which is the willingness to pay, and we end up with a symmetric Nash of 350. But in reality, depending on relative bargaining power, the price could be anywhere between $2 and $5. It's just a negotiation. And whoever has more patience in some way, well, sometimes economists put it that way, or more bargaining power, depends on if it's closer to 5 or closer to 2. The role for regulation in this case is interesting because normally when we think of regulation is in the early example is the purpose of regulation is to cut price to increase quantity. But in this case, you can't cut price to increase quantity. I'm dealing on a customer by customer, a buyer by buyer specific negotiation. We either do the deal or we don't. You have a willingness to pay and I have a cost, and anything at cost or above is worth doing. Anything for the consumer at willingness to pay or less is worth doing. Okay? But there's no way that regulation can interject itself into this deal and make something happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. Okay? And this is much like in economics the bilateral monopoly scenario, in which when two monopolists negotiate with each other, they reach the outcome of competitive output because that's the most surplus, and then they quibble over how they cut it between the two of them. Okay, but the goal is to maximize the value. In this case, the goal is to make the exchange as long, I mean, if buyer B only valued it at 1, there's no deal to be had. If cost was 10, there was no deal to be had. Okay, it has to be that the willingness to pay exceeds the cost. Now we can, if we regulated the price at 2 or less than 2, there's no deal, right? Because the seller says, no, I can't sell it for that. If I regulated the price above 5, there's no deal because I'm not willing to pay that. Okay? Now I'm going somewhere with this. And it's to special access. Now, I'm not telling you what my opinion of the market is here. I'm telling you what I have seen in the discussion of this issue by the FCC and others. These are descriptions of the geographic market for special access services. Individual customer location, each customer location, customer by customer location, particular customer's location, specific end user's location. How many buyers are there at a particular customer's location? There's a buyer. It is a particular customer's location. Okay. Now, not all cases it's like that. For example, you can get special access circuits between a switch and a tandem, which may have many potential buyers. But a cell tower, something like that, a point of presence in a weird place that's not common, is an instance where we're talking about these specific end users' locations. So now I got a case where I've got one buyer in the market. Okay, this is this case. And as was just discussed, if there's only one buyer, even if there's only one seller, regulation can't fix the problem. Okay? There's nothing that regulation can do favorable because the deal will go down as long as there's a deal to be had. It's in everybody's incentive that's involved to do a deal. And that I can't lower price and increase output. I can't raise price and reduce output. I can't change the total surplus in the market because as long as it's positive, potential surplus is positive, a deal goes down. Now that's not to say that regulation is costless, okay? Because what might happen is, as I discussed in the example, what if regulation sets a price below 2? Then I'm blocking deals that would have occurred that now do not occur because it's not in the interest of the seller. And even if, like the FCC can probably do, mandate that you offer it, it still lowers total surplus because I'm forcing someone to sell something at a rate that's below cost, which is not good for surplus. If I set a price that's too high, okay, because regulation is essentially doing what? It's setting a uniform price. And this is kind of the problem when I say the problem with monopoly is not single seller, it's a uniform price. What regulation is going to do is set a uniform price and lead to excess uniformity. Whereas if you're dealing in a one buyer, one seller environment, what you really want is great variability. Because each circuit's going to cost something different and each circuit's going to have a value that's different, and you sit down and negotiate over that deal, and the deal's going to happen if there's a positive surplus to be had. So that is an interesting little twist on applying somewhat basic economics to the arguments that are being made. I find it interesting. I'm not saying the way this is the market is, I'm just interpreting what's been written about it, that you have, on the one hand, you have this mentality from antitrust that if you're trying to merge, you hire an economist that'll say the market is the universe and includes everything, okay, because that makes you as a merging party look very trivial, right? That's the inclination. That's what happens in antitrust cases. The merging parties want the market to be big. Those that oppose the merger want what? The market to be quite small, because now that makes your market share very large. Okay, so this is, and you see this at the FCC as well, is you play with the market definition to try to either reduce my market share or to increase my opponent's market share. And that's the same mentality, I think, that played into special access, but it went to the extreme to make the market a single customer, which then creates this bilateral monopoly situation, which means regulation is pointless, for the most part, in a partial sense. But it can actually be costly because it can force non-economic transactions or preclude economic transactions with too much uniformity. For example, if you don't have downward pricing flexibility, you might be willing to enter an agreement that you've been precluded from entering. Now there may be some issues. You know, how are you defining social welfare is a question. If you have other markets, special access is viewed as an intermediate market, how does it affect downstream markets? How far do you go with long-term industry structure and things like that? But I think the point there is that the FCC has an obligation to define what its objective function is. And I suppose probably what it will define it to be is lower prices, rather than having any real meaningful objective function, rather than actually explicitly stating to increase surplus. It'll just say lower prices, where lower prices may have actually no effect or a negative effect on social welfare. And there's issues of fixed cost. If you get into the antitrust world, if special access is a fixed cost, then does it have any effect on downstream prices? These are interesting questions that all have to be addressed in a full model of the problem. But I think economically, it's an excellent case to look at the arguments being made, applying an economic argument to it, and seeing through the problem with the argument that comes from the general place of shrink the market to make these guys look bad. Actually, you shrunk the market so bad it makes regulation irrelevant, which is an interesting effect. So we got only 5-10 minutes for questions. And I guess I'll hand that over to Jerry.
Well, you've heard three perspectives. Just when you think maybe economists had nothing new to say, there clearly ample opportunity for application of either of fairly basic ideas to illuminate problems that policymakers have to deal with. So we have a few minutes for a few questions on any of the topics presented by our economists today. Or perhaps do the
good, Jerry. Hi.
Here we go.
Hi, Russ Hanser. So my question's for George. George, I think you and I probably agree on the policy questions presented by Special Access, but I had two questions about your presentation. So one is, you didn't use the word, I don't think you used the word information, and it seems to me that if there are informational asymmetries, then the Nash equilibria, those affect the Nash equilibria you talked about, and to the extent the seller has an informational advantage, price is going to it's going to be able to price along the demand curve, which may maximize surplus, but also puts it all in the producer surplus, the profit, rather than the consumer surplus. So curious about how you think that plays out in this market. And then maybe I'll remember my second question.
Okay, while I talk. Or maybe you'll come up with a new one. Yes, when you have a situation like in my example where you had a minimum price of 2 and a maximum price of 5, for example, there are all kinds of factors that will influence where the price ends up. Okay, if the price is $5, that means the seller wins it all. If the price is $2, then the consumer wins it all potential surplus. And in the Nash, symmetric Nash, which has gobs of assumptions to go with it, but it was a worthy idea, won a Nobel Prize, is that you split it. You know, just say, okay, you're willing to pay 5, I'm willing to take 2, let's just make it 350 and we're both happy. As information asymmetry exists, it will tend to favor one side or the other. As patience is the way it is often modeled in economics, is how long are you willing to wait? Or we generally speak of it as relative bargaining power. If one firm has the juice, then the price will favor him. The point is that it doesn't matter how that gets split. The surplus is always $3. I may get it all, you may get it all, but the surplus is 3. And the purpose, generally when we think of regulation, is that we want to lower price to increase quantity to raise surplus. Or really, we're trying to raise surplus, and we just do that through cutting price and increasing quantity. But in this case, you can't really do that. Now, if you, as I noted, it's a sort of partial equilibrium kind of thing. If you think about, well, maybe this is an intermediate market and they may have impacts downstream or whatever, you know, you have to get into those questions too if you want to. But it really doesn't matter. The surplus is always 3. Okay, so, which is why I describe it in the work we've done as really a squabble over rent. You know, it's just, do I get it or do you get it? And using the regulatory processes, which is what many economists will say the regulatory process is used for, is merely to shift rents between economic giants, which is, for example, network neutrality regulation.
One other question? Well, if not, I want to thank each of our panelists this morning for, as usual, a very stimulating presentations, and thank them for appearing this morning.